There's a wound most men carry that no one sees. It doesn't come from betrayal. It doesn't come from loud humiliation or dramatic exits. It comes from a quieter place, when the woman he loves stops looking at him the same way, and he stays. When her words begin to flatten his presence in front of others, and he says nothing. When the tone shifts, the edge arrives, the respect dissolves, and he swallows it, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because he still believes staying calm is the same as staying whole. He doesn't speak up. He calls it patience, but what he's really doing is disappearing. Most men confuse tolerance with virtue. They wear it like a badge. I don't react, they say. I take the high road. And on the surface, it looks noble. But underneath, there's a slow erosion happening, of identity, of dignity, of inner authority. You start telling yourself it's maturity. You start thinking endurance makes you strong. But there's a point where enduring becomes self-erasure, where your silence stops being strength and starts being submission. And by the time you notice, she's no longer looking at you like a man. She's looking through you, like someone who forgot you ever stood tall. Zeno of Citium lost everything in a shipwreck. But he didn't try to rebuild what drowned. He didn't swim back to broken pieces. He stood on new ground, and from that loss he built a new life, a new philosophy. You don't need to be a philosopher to understand the truth behind that story. Sometimes what breaks you is a gift, because it forces you to stop trying to restore what was never meant to survive. Sometimes the loss is the invitation to stop negotiating with your own soul. Marcus Aurelius said, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." But it's not just your thoughts, it's your tolerances. What you allow, you absorb. What you let slide stains you, and every moment you let disrespect go unchecked. Every laugh you give to a joke that belittles you, every time you nod and say, "It's fine," when it isn't, your soul fades, from gold to gray, from presence to shadow, and you wake up one day wondering why no one listens when you speak. This isn't about controlling her. It's not about posturing or asserting dominance. It's about emotional boundaries, without noise, without aggression, just the quiet presence of a man who knows who he is and what he cannot afford to tolerate, not because he's proud, but because he's loyal to his soul. The man she truly respects isn't the one who roars. It's the one who doesn't bend where it matters, the one who walks, not out of anger, but out of self-honor. The truth is simple. If you tolerate it once, she notices. If you tolerate it twice, she adapts. If you tolerate it long enough, she forgets who you were, and then, so do you. This video isn't about blame. It's not about rage. It's about remembering. Because respect isn't claimed, it's encoded, one silent decision at a time. Let's begin. It doesn't come with shouting. There's no warning, no dramatic collapse. Just a moment, so quiet you almost miss it. A smirk during a conversation with friends. A tone that flattens your voice in public. A story she tells at your expense while others laugh. You feel it, even if you pretend not to. Your gut stiffens, your heart tightens, but your mouth says nothing, because you've been trained, by the world, by your past, maybe even by her, to stay calm, to not make a scene, to be the bigger man. So you stay silent, and in that silence, something small breaks. Most men freeze, not because they don't see it, but because they don't know what to do with it. The moment catches them off guard. Their instincts don't scream, they whisper, but that whisper is the truth. A truth we often ignore. Instead of confronting it, we rationalize. She's just tired. It's not a big deal. Maybe I did something to deserve it, and so we stay. We smooth it over, we move on, but our nervous system doesn't. It logs it, it encodes it, and so does hers. There's a shift in the unspoken hierarchy of your relationship. You didn't respond. So the dynamic rewrites itself. You became safe to diminish, like a wolf that lowers its gaze, not out of wisdom, but out of surrender. That one moment, it may seem small, but it resets how she sees you and how you see yourself. The mind doesn't forget disrespect, even when the mouth says, "It's fine," even when the heart wants to forgive. What you allow once becomes the new standard. And in that quiet concession, in that tiny hesitation, something permanent happens. Not loud, but irreversible. She may not say it, but you'll feel it. The air changes, the respect thins, and a man who lets that moment pass, without presence, without pause, without reclaiming his weight, is a man already stepping into invisibility. It doesn't start with betrayal. It doesn't begin with some grand loss of power. It begins with 3 words. It's okay. You say it after a disrespectful comment, after she talks over you, after a decision gets made without you. You say it because you don't want conflict, because you believe peace is more important than pride. But those 3 words don't bring peace. They bring erosion. You laugh when you shouldn't, not because it's funny, but because it's easier than confrontation. You nod when something inside you says no, not because you agree, but because you've been taught that your boundaries are negotiable. You tell yourself this is emotional maturity, that you're being composed, that you're taking the high road, but what you're really doing is slowly rewriting your role from man to accessory, from presence to permission. Over time, this becomes a habit, not just in your words, but in your nervous system. Your body starts encoding tolerance as safety. You breathe shallower. You speak less. You hesitate more. You stop initiating. You wait for her to decide, for her to lead, for her to validate. You become secondary. And the worst part is, you convince yourself this is strength. She sees it, maybe not consciously at first, but she feels it. The man who used to take up space now folds himself to keep peace. The one who used to draw lines now draws smiles. There's no hate, no contempt, just disinterest. You become familiar, predictable, easy to ignore, and you didn't get there through one grand failure. You got there through tiny moments where you said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. He never yelled, he never raised his voice, but he disappeared anyway. Not into silence, but into compliance. He still showed up, still paid the bills, still did everything right, but he wasn't there anymore. Not in the room, not in himself. His body stayed, but the man had already gone. That's how authority dies. Not in war, but in slow agreement with what dishonors you. You don't chase approval because you're weak. You chase it because somewhere deep inside there's a fracture. Old, buried, and still bleeding. Maybe it came from a father who never looked you in the eyes. Maybe it came from a woman who praised you only when you performed. Or maybe it came from years of being told that your worth depended on how small you could make yourself to keep the peace. And so you learned to adapt, to please, to mold yourself into what she needed, even if it meant dissolving who you were. But the man who lives for approval forgets his own reflection. He wakes up every day measuring his value by how she feels about him. He becomes a mirror, not a man. He anticipates her reactions before he speaks. He edits his truth before it's even voiced. He doesn't say what he believes. He says what will be accepted. That's not compassion. That's not love. That's shame, dressed in politeness. Stoicism isn't about shutting down. It's about rooting in. It's about standing in who you are, even when your voice shakes, even when you're alone in that room. Approval is not something you should beg for. It's something that follows presence. It follows clarity. It follows a man who knows who he is and no longer trades authenticity for affection. When you seek approval, you're always one step behind, always one reflection late. It's like chasing shadows in a mirror. No matter how fast you run, the image was never yours to begin with. And the more you reach for it, the more you forget your original shape. Leadership isn't loud, it isn't forceful. It's quiet, sovereign, and unmoved by external applause. The man she respects doesn't seek her validation. He honors his direction. And if she joins, it's by choice, not persuasion, not performance. The second you abandon yourself to stay liked, you've already lost the part of you she was drawn to in the first place. You weren't wrong for caring. You weren't wrong for trying to hold the relationship together, for showing up, for forgiving, for loving past your limits. That wasn't weakness, that was belief. But there's a point where belief becomes betrayal, when you cross your own boundaries in the name of peace, when your desire to be good costs you the core of who you are. That's not loyalty, that's abandonment, not of her, of yourself. Being nice is often just fear dressed in softness, fear of loss, fear of confrontation, fear of not being enough unless you overextend. But loyalty, real loyalty, includes you. It includes your needs, your values, your dignity. The man who sacrifices himself to remain chosen ends up erased, even while being held, because he's no longer leading his life. He's reacting to someone else's moods, hopes, and decisions. Seneca said, "He who is brave is free." But freedom doesn't come from being liked. It comes from standing in your own truth without apology, from drawing a quiet line and holding it, not in anger, but in reverence for your own soul. The man who bends at every request loses shape. He becomes agreeable, predictable, and eventually forgettable. There was a man once who always said yes. Yes to plans he didn't want. Yes to silence when he was hurting. Yes to her reality while burying his own. He wasn't spineless. He was loyal, too loyal. Until one day he couldn't remember what he wanted anymore. Couldn't remember when he last said no. Couldn't remember the sound of his own truth. That's what happens when niceness replaces identity. You become easy to love, but hard to see. Loyalty to yourself isn't selfish. It's sacred. It's what makes your presence real. What makes your word matter. What gives your silence weight. When you stop asking for permission to be whole, you don't become rude. You become rooted. And the man who is rooted doesn't need to explain his strength. He just stands. And others adjust. Or walk away. Either way, he remains. It always begins with doubt. Not hers, yours. You feel something shift. But instead of honoring it, you question yourself. Maybe she's just tired. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I was too quiet, too sensitive, too needy. And just like that, the negotiation begins. Not with her, but within you. You take something that hurt, and you bargain with it. You shave down your own instincts to make her behavior more comfortable to live with. But comfort is not clarity, and what you tolerate to keep her calm becomes what you teach her to repeat. You stop naming the moments that cut you. You stop drawing lines. You start folding in subtle ways. A joke here, a dismissal there, a canceled plan brushed off with a smile. You tell yourself it's no big deal, but your body remembers. Every "maybe it's nothing" is a quiet signal to your nervous system that your voice doesn't matter, that your boundaries are negotiable, that your truth isn't worth disturbing the peace. Over time, your tolerance becomes your training. You train her to know that your silence means permission. You train yourself to absorb more pain without release, and both of you adjust. She stops respecting your reactions. You stop expecting to be heard, and what was once a man becomes a shadow, present but powerless, calm but hollow. The mind can lie, the heart can hope, but the body doesn't forget. The way your stomach tightens when you're dismissed, the way your chest sinks when you say, "It's fine," and mean the opposite. These aren't just emotions. They're signals. And when you ignore them long enough, they stop whispering. They harden into fatigue, into resentment, into identity loss. Boundaries aren't walls to keep her out. They're mirrors to reflect who you still are. When you stop enforcing them, the reflection fades, and the man in the mirror becomes unrecognizable. Not because he changed overnight, but because he chipped away at himself one unspoken truth at a time. You didn't lose her respect in a single moment. You lost it in the silence between 1,000 moments where you should have stood and didn't. There comes a point where explanation becomes a trap, where justifying your standards only invites more erosion. You try to communicate, you try to be fair, you try to show her what you need. But every time you explain what should already be sacred, you lose a little more of your presence, because the truth is, what you tolerate teaches more than what you say. Refusal doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't need volume. It doesn't need warning. It simply needs to be embodied. You don't owe her a speech. You don't owe her an emotional breakdown. You owe yourself a return to self-respect, and sometimes that return begins in silence, a silence that doesn't retreat, but reclaims. Emotional leadership isn't about control. It's about containment, about knowing what belongs inside your circle and what doesn't, about being the kind of man who doesn't need to yell to establish a boundary. His presence alone is enough. His silence, when anchored in truth, says more than any raised voice ever could. Zeno didn't rebuild the chaos. He walked away from the noise. He chose the inner clarity that doesn't seek revenge, doesn't demand understanding. It simply departs, not because it gave up, but because it finally remembered its own weight. That's what refusal looks like. Calm, clear, unshakable. There's a moment in every man's life where the most powerful thing he can do is stop responding. Stop absorbing. Stop proving, not with bitterness, not with coldness, but with a quiet decision to no longer shrink for someone else's comfort. A man once heard words meant to break him. He didn't defend. He didn't argue. He didn't storm out. He simply stood, looked at her, and said nothing. He left the words in the air, let them echo, let her sit with them, because not every insult deserves an answer. Some things only deserve distance. That moment, that refusal without reaction, isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new code, a new shape, A new man who no longer negotiates his dignity for the illusion of peace. He doesn't speak louder, he simply stops explaining, and in doing so, becomes unmovable. He didn't see it all at once. It happened slowly. She used to look at him with admiration, with softness, with presence, but over time, her gaze changed. It lost its weight. It moved past him instead of landing on him. He told himself it was normal, that relationships change, that maybe this is just what love looks like after the fire burns down. But deep inside, he knew something else had gone quiet, not in her, but in him. He thought endurance was proof of love, that if he could just hold on longer, be more patient, more understanding, she'd come back to the man she once respected. So he stayed through the silences that felt like absence, stayed through the jokes that made him small, stayed through the growing distance, the polite conversations, the nights that ended with backs turned. He stayed, not because he was weak, but because he believed. And that belief became the rope he used to tie himself to a version of her that no longer existed. There was no explosion, no final argument, just a slow unraveling. He stopped being invited into her thoughts. Her body grew cold, her tone lost warmth, and he adapted, like a man adjusting to a colder climate. Layer by layer, he learned to live without being seen. Until one day, he wasn't. She didn't hate him. She didn't despise him. She just stopped feeling him. Because he had stopped being something to feel. He had become predictable, agreeable, comfortable. The man who once challenged her to rise now existed only to keep the peace. And the peace cost him everything. He used to speak with conviction. Now he nodded. He used to set the tone. Now he followed it. He used to lead with presence. Now he waited for instructions. And when she finally left, not physically but emotionally, he was still standing there, still hoping, still trying, still tolerating. The tragedy wasn't that she stopped loving him. It was that she no longer had to, because there was nothing left to hold, nothing left to lose. Just a man in a room, sitting in a chair that was still warm, but already empty. He didn't leave when he should have. He didn't speak when it mattered. And in the end, he didn't break. He disappeared, quietly, completely. And no one noticed, not even her. Zeno's ship went down. Everything he knew, everything he built, swallowed by the sea. But he didn't dive in after the wreckage. He didn't try to recover what the storm had claimed. He let it go. And from that loss, he gave birth to something greater. Not a business, not a reputation, but a new philosophy. A way of living rooted not in what he had, but in who he had become. That's the lesson most men miss. You don't repair what destroyed your voice. You don't rebuild what required your erasure. You become the man who outgrew it. Chrysippus, one of Zeno's successors, said that reason must not only observe, but act. Because when emotion muddies the waters, clarity isn't passive. It moves. It draws lines. It walks out of rooms that no longer recognize your worth. It speaks, sometimes without words, sometimes with nothing more than absence. This isn't about revenge. It isn't about getting her back. It's about getting yourself back. Not the version that tolerated to keep peace, but the one who remembers what silence feels like when it's grounded, not defeated. The one who doesn't flinch when disrespected. The one who walks, not because he's angry, but because he refuses to rot in a space that requires him to shrink. Respect isn't demanded. It's encoded into the way you sit, the way you breathe, the way you no longer explain your boundaries, into the pauses between your words, into the quiet refusal to be small. So picture this, a room, still, everything exactly where you left it, nothing moved, not because of peace, but because you've become invisible. That's what tolerance buys you. That's the cost of avoiding conflict at the expense of your soul. And the only way back isn't louder words or desperate acts. It's refusal, absolute, calm, unshakable, because the man she respects, the one the world still feels when he's silent, is the one who no longer tolerates what his soul cannot survive.